Welcome to Land of Horror, where horror stories come to life like never before. In today's video, we will explore chilling true events, unsolved mysteries, and the fears lurking in the shadows. From bone-chilling murder cases to supernatural phenomena that defy all explanation, each story will take you on a journey filled with tension and suspense. You will hear about real individuals who have faced terrifying moments, life and death situations, and discoveries that send chills down anyone's spine. Prepare yourself for moments of anxiety and thrills, because these stories aren't just fiction, but the dark truths of life. Don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications to join us in uncovering even more horrifying mysteries. It was a bitterly cold December night in Portland. The kind of cold that seemed to penetrate through every layer of clothing, leaving a lingering chill in your bones no matter how much you wrapped up. The city was under a thick fog, which lay heavily over the streets, swallowing the sound of footsteps, streetcars, and even the faint hum of distant traffic. The air was still, the kind of stillness that felt unnerving, almost unnatural. It was the kind of night where the world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jason Thompson stepped out of the airport's sliding glass doors, the sharp bite of the wind hitting him instantly. He glanced at his watch, 12:32 a.m. His flight had been delayed for over an hour, and by the time he finally landed, the tram to the city center had been scheduled to leave in less than 10 minutes. He cursed softly under his breath. His family had warned him about the holiday chaos, but the delays and the unexpected snowstorm earlier in the day had thrown everything off track. The Max tram station was just across the street, nestled under a small concrete overhang, with bright fluorescent lights flickering above. Jason pulled his jacket tighter around him, his breath visible in the cold air, and hurried to the platform, his boots crunching over the icy pavement. As he approached the stairs that led down to the station, he noticed the eerie silence. It was the kind of silence that seemed out of place for a public transportation hub at this hour, where even the occasional drunkards or tired travelers would be present, filling the space with the hum of human noise. Tonight, though, there was nothing. Jason hesitated for a moment, looking around the empty parking lot. A couple of streetlights flickered in the distance, their bulbs humming softly, but the usual murmur of Portland's late-night energy was nowhere to be found. It felt like the city had gone to sleep, and maybe even forgotten to wake up. He glanced back at the airport terminal, as if checking to see if anyone else was behind him, but it was just him, alone, in the dead of night. The Max tram was due to arrive at 12:42. Jason sighed in relief, realizing he would just make it. He hurried down the stairs and stepped onto the platform, his shoes slapping lightly against the wet pavement. He was tired, physically and emotionally. It had been a long trip. The holiday visit to his family's home in Boise had been bittersweet, full of awkward moments and silent glances, only exacerbated by the stress of the long flight. Now, all he wanted was to get home, throw on his sweatpants, and relax with a cup of tea in his dim-lit apartment. The tram wasn't there yet, but a faint rumble in the distance told him it was coming. Jason took a deep breath, the icy air burning his lungs, and pulled his phone out of his pocket. He scrolled through the notifications on his screen, emails, texts, social media posts that he would deal with later. His mind was still stuck on the events of the last few days, but he had learned to block it all out. Tonight, it was just him and the quiet streets of Portland. He wasn't exactly sure what had drawn his attention, but the sound of footsteps behind him made him glance over his shoulder. A man stood at the top of the stairs, shrouded in the shadows of the overhang. Jason couldn't see his face, but his shape was unmistakable. He was tall, wearing a long coat that hung low over his knees, and his movements seemed slow and deliberate. He wasn't a local. Jason had spent enough time in Portland to recognize the regulars who took the max. This man was a stranger. Jason felt the first stirrings of discomfort in his stomach. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, but he shook the feeling off. The guy was probably just another traveler heading home, or to a nearby shelter. Jason glanced back at the train track, waiting for the tram to appear through the fog. The man took a step forward, and Jason turned back to face him. Their eyes met for the briefest second, but Jason quickly looked away, feeling his pulse quicken. The man's expression was impossible to read. His face was mostly obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, and his shoulders were hunched forward as if he were trying to keep out the biting cold. There was something about the way he moved, almost too slow, too deliberate for a late-night traveler, but Jason had no reason to be paranoid. Right. Jason pulled his jacket tighter around his body, trying to shake off the unease. This wasn't the time or the place to be thinking about things that didn't make sense. He heard the approaching tram now, its low rumble growing louder, cutting through the silence. He turned back toward the tracks, trying to focus on the rhythm of the tram's wheels against the rails. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something strange. The man was now walking toward the tram station, his pace steady but unnervingly slow, almost as if he was moving through a fog of his own, a place between sleep and wakefulness. Jason's heart thudded in his chest as he watched him come closer. There was no hurry in the man's step, no sense of urgency like most people who caught the late-night tram. Just a cold, mechanical walk, and then a slight stumble. Jason's stomach twisted. As the tram arrived with a screech and a hiss, the man seemed to stagger, but caught himself before he fell. Jason couldn't help but notice how dirty the man's clothes were, worn and faded, stained with what looked like a combination of mud and old rain. His shoes were scuffed and worn to the point where they no longer seemed functional. The tram's doors opened with a dull whoosh, and Jason stepped inside, finding an empty seat near the window. He glanced back, but the man was still standing by the entrance, his eyes fixed ahead, his body leaning slightly, as if the weight of the world was too much for him to carry. Jason settled into his seat, feeling the weight of exhaustion settling on his shoulders. He would just ride home and get some rest. Maybe he'd check in with his mom in the morning, if he could muster up the energy. As the tram pulled away from the station, he glanced out the window, the fog closing in around them like a thick veil. He glanced back inside the tram. The man had taken a seat several rows ahead of him. His head was now resting against the window, eyes closed as though he had fallen into a deep sleep. Jason shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He tried to distract himself by scrolling through his phone, but there was a nagging feeling gnawing at him. He couldn't quite place it, an odd sensation, like he wasn't alone, even though the tram was completely empty, except for him and the man up front. There was something off about the way the man had entered the tram. His movements, his lack of reaction to anything going on around him, were starting to make Jason feel uneasy. As the tram continued to roll through the foggy streets of Portland, Jason tried to shake off the discomfort. The man was probably just another person who had come from the airport, tired and needing a break from the world. Jason was being paranoid. He focused on the rhythmic thrum of the train beneath him, the monotonous sound that usually brought comfort, but tonight it felt hollow. For the first time in a long time, Jason felt that strange, undeniable feeling that something wasn't right. And then, just as the tram turned a corner, something made him look back again. The man's head was tilted unnaturally against the window. Jason stared, his heart thumping faster. The man wasn't moving. Jason was trying to shake off the strange feeling that had begun to creep up on him, gnawing at the back of his mind. His eyes kept flicking to the man sitting just a few rows ahead of him, the one who had entered the tram at the airport. There was something about the man that felt off. The tram hummed through the streets of Portland, gliding smoothly over the tracks. Jason's own reflection stared back at him from the window, dark circles under his eyes, the dull, exhausted look of a traveler who had been awake for far too long. He was tired, but something deeper than fatigue was nagging at him. The man's presence unsettled him, though he couldn't quite figure out why. It wasn't that the man had done anything directly. No. It was more than that. The way he had entered the tram, without any acknowledgement of his surroundings, the way he had slumped into his seat without a word, it just didn't seem right. Jason tried to focus on the text messages he had received during his flight. A few from his friend Mark asking if he had made it back safely. His mom checking in on him. And then there were the spam messages that had made him roll his eyes and quickly delete. He glanced back at the man. He was still slumped against the window, completely still. Not even a subtle shift in his body as the tram rattled down the tracks. He was too still. Jason frowned and shifted in his seat. He thought he saw the man's chest rise slightly as if he was breathing, but even that seemed faint and slow, almost imperceptible. The more Jason looked, the more it seemed like the man's head was too low against the window, his posture too awkward. A few more minutes passed, and Jason couldn't shake the odd feeling that had settled in the pit of his stomach. It was like the man was not there, even though he was sitting right in front of him. As if something was wrong, something subtle but undeniable. Finally, Jason could no longer resist the urge to look directly at the man. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, studying the figure in the seat. The man's head was resting at an unnatural angle against the glass, almost as if it had slumped too far forward while he slept. His limbs were slack, his body lifeless. Jason's heart picked up pace. Was the man unconscious? Was he asleep, or something more serious? Jason couldn't help but think about how strange it was that the man had entered the tram, with no expression, no acknowledgement of the world around him. Jason hesitated, glancing around at the nearly empty tram. There were no other passengers, no one else to witness what was happening. It was just him, the man, and the slowly passing Portland streets. He swallowed hard, his mind racing. Could the man be sick? Had he fallen asleep in such a strange position that it was causing him to look lifeless? As the tram continued its journey through the dark streets, Jason couldn't help but let his imagination run wild. He tried to tell himself he was being paranoid. The man was probably just drunk or exhausted from the late hour. Or maybe he was just a homeless man who had passed out after a long day. But then again, he hadn't seen the man drink anything or even move since he sat down. And if the man had been drunk, surely he would have shifted or adjusted his posture by now, right? Surely, someone would have woken up by this point. Jason blinked and rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the nagging discomfort. It wasn't like him to get this worked up over something so trivial. But something in the air, the way the fog seemed to wrap around the tram, thick and suffocating, and the way the tram lights flickered, was making him feel uneasy. Suddenly, the tram jolted slightly as it pulled into a station. Jason's body tensed as the doors opened, revealing the familiar platform. The train slowed, and the faint echo of footsteps could be heard outside. The platform was empty. No one had gotten on, and the silence was even more oppressive than before. Jason glanced back at the man, who had not moved an inch. He frowned. Was this guy Asleep or just dead to the world? Jason looked at the man's hands, dirty, cracked skin with bits of grime stuck under his fingernails. The man's shirt was wrinkled and stained, and his shoes were worn down to nothing. His clothes were torn in places, and there was a musty smell about him that Jason couldn't quite place. The tram continued on, passing through another station and down a winding street that was lit only by the occasional street lamp. Jason sighed, feeling a sense of growing unease. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper as he leaned forward in his seat. No response. Jason watched the man's head against the window. The man hadn't moved, not even a flicker of movement. His eyes remained closed, his expression blank. Jason could almost hear his own breath rattling in his chest, louder and more rapid than usual. A sudden wave of nausea rolled through him. This was strange. Too strange. He stood up slowly, his legs trembling as he approached the man. He was close enough now to see the dirt cake into the man's skin, the smell of sweat and old alcohol rising from his clothes. Jason's stomach churned. His thoughts raced. Could the man be alive? Or was he just passed out? He reached out, hesitantly placing his hand on the man's shoulder, gently shaking him. "Hey, wake up," he said, his voice louder this time. The man didn't budge. Jason's heart raced now, his anxiety growing. His hand hovered for a moment, unsure. This wasn't right. He gave the man a harder shake, his grip tightening. Still nothing. No movement. No response. Jason's mind went into overdrive. He stepped back, his breathing shallow, his pulse racing in his ears. Something was wrong. Very wrong. He glanced around the tram again. There was no one else here, just him and the man. His hands trembled as he pulled his phone from his pocket. He was already dialing 911 before he realized what he was doing. 911, what's your emergency? Jason's voice was sharp, panicked. There's a man on the Max tram. He's not responding. I think he might be. I don't know, but he's not moving. Sir, calm down. Is he breathing? Is there a pulse? Jason stepped closer to the man, trying to steady his shaking hands. He leaned in close, pressing his ear to the man's chest. There was no sound, no breath, no faint beating of a heart. The man was still. Jason felt the ground beneath him sway, and his stomach heaved as his phone dropped from his hand. He staggered back, his body weak and shaking. The harsh reality of the situation started to sink in. The man was dead. Jason's breath quickened, his chest heaving with the sudden rush of panic that flooded his veins. He stared at the man slumped in the seat, the realization slowly sinking in. The man was dead. The utter stillness in his body, the lack of breath, it was all too much. His hands trembled as they gripped the cold metal rail of the tram. The 911 operator's voice came through the phone, far too calm for the chaos building inside him. Jason's mind felt fractured, like he was observing this whole scene from the outside, watching his own reaction to the events as if it were happening to someone else. Sir? Can you hear me? The operator repeated, her voice sharp, pulling him back into the moment. You need to stay on the line. Help is on the way. Jason blinked hard, trying to focus on her words. He felt disconnected, his mind struggling to piece together the events of the last few minutes. He had shaken the man, tried to wake him up. There was no response. No sign of life. I think he's dead, Jason finally managed to say, his voice trembling. "Sir, stay calm," the operator replied. "We've dispatched an officer to your location. Is there anyone else on the tram with you? Any witnesses?" Jason glanced around the tram, as though expecting someone to pop out of the shadows, but it was still completely empty. Just him and the man, lifeless in the seat. "No," Jason said. "Just me. I'm alone with him." The operator paused for a moment, probably making a note of the information. "Sir, I need you to remain on the line. Do you know if there's any identification on him? Anything that could help?" Jason felt a wave of nausea rise up in his throat. He didn't want to get close to the man any more than he already had, but he knew he would have to check for any personal items, any indication of who this person was. Slowly, reluctantly, Jason stood up and took a few careful steps toward the man. His pulse pounded in his ears. He looked down at the lifeless body, the man's face still slumped against the cold window. There was an eerie stillness about him, as if time had stopped for this person. Jason felt the air around him grow colder, though he couldn't tell if it was the winter chill or the rising sense of dread crawling up his spine. The man's jacket was worn, stained with dirt and grime. Jason could see the frayed edges of the fabric, the scuffed shoes that looked like they hadn't seen a proper wash in years. But there was nothing that stood out to indicate who the man was, other than the empty, hollow expression on his face. No wallet. No phone. Nothing. Jason swallowed hard and stepped closer, his breath heavy in his throat. He hesitated, unsure whether he wanted to touch the man. The silence in the tram was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the train wheels. The operator's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Sir, are you still with me? Have you found anything?" Jason glanced at his phone. "I don't know," he said, his voice strained. "He doesn't have anything on him. No wallet. No ID. Okay, we'll try to identify him when the police arrive. For now, just stay with him and try not to disturb anything further. We'll get help to you as soon as possible." Jason couldn't tear his eyes away from the man. The dead man. The horror of the situation hit him all at once. What was he supposed to do now? Sit here on this tram and wait for the police to arrive? How long would that take? There was no one else to share the weight of the moment with him. Just him, alone, in the cold night, watching a stranger's body slowly become one with the darkness outside. He glanced at the windows. The fog had thickened, rolling in from the city streets, pressing against the glass. The only source of light was the harsh, flickering street lamps and the dim interior of the tram. The city seemed far away, swallowed by the mist. It was as though the world had forgotten about him, had forgotten about the man slumped in the seat beside him. Jason rubbed his eyes, trying to keep his mind from spiraling. His stomach twisted. He had seen death before. His father had passed away a few years back, after a long battle with cancer. But this was different. This man had simply collapsed. Had he been sick? Had he overdosed on something? Suddenly, the tram jerked again, and Jason nearly stumbled. He gripped the rail tightly, feeling disoriented. He took a deep breath and steadied himself. He couldn't afford to lose control now. The police were on their way. All he had to do was wait. But the longer he stared at the man, the more he felt the weight of the situation. He was alone with the body. Alone with the dead. The sense of isolation was thick, like the fog pressing against the glass. He thought about the man's lifeless eyes, about how his body had fallen so limply into the seat. How could someone just die like that, without a sound, without a struggle? Jason moved toward the window and stared out, his reflection merging with the thick fog outside. He thought he saw a flicker of movement, a shadow in the mist, but when he blinked, it was gone. Probably just his imagination. The phone in his hand buzzed. It was a message from Mark, asking if he was okay. He stared at it for a moment, his fingers hovering above the keyboard. He couldn't bring himself to respond. What could he say? He couldn't explain what had just happened. How could he tell someone that he was sitting alone, with a dead body, on a tram at 1:30 in the morning? His hands shook as he put the phone back in his pocket, staring at the man once more. His breathing was shallow, and his pulse still raced. His mind was spinning. He had to think. What should he do next? Suddenly, the tram hit a bump, and the lights flickered again. For a brief moment, everything went dark. Jason froze, holding his breath, his eyes wide open in the sudden blackness. The tram rattled to a stop, the lights returning moments later. Jason's pulse quickened. He felt a chill run down his spine. The body, it hadn't moved. He glanced at the man again. Nothing had changed. But something felt off. Was it his imagination, or did the man look even more lifeless than before? Jason stumbled backward, his legs weak beneath him. He tried to steady himself, but his breath caught in his throat. He felt trapped in this tiny, claustrophobic space with the dead man. Was he imagining things? Or had something truly happened during those few seconds of darkness? The tram had been so quiet, so still, and then there had been the brief flicker of the lights. Had the man moved? Had he? No. Jason shook his head and pushed the thoughts away. The man hadn't moved. He was still dead, just as he had been before. His phone buzzed again, pulling him out of his thoughts. He glanced down. It was a notification from the Max System app. Next stop, Pioneer Square. Estimated arrival in 3 minutes. Jason's blood ran cold. Pioneer Square. That was where the police were supposed to meet him. They would be waiting there. He had to get to that stop. The thought of sitting with the body until they arrived made his stomach churn. With a trembling hand, Jason grabbed his coat and pulled it tighter around his shoulders. He glanced one last time at the man, his pale face, eyes still closed, breathing impossible to detect, and headed for the door. His heart pounded, each beat seeming to echo inside his skull. Every fiber of his being screamed to get off the tram, to run away, to forget this entire night ever happened. But he couldn't. He had to wait. As the tram slowly started moving again, Jason gripped the rail tightly, trying to steady his racing thoughts. The fog outside seemed to swallow the city whole, wrapping it in a thick, damp blanket. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened during the blackout. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't find an answer. And as the tram rumbled down the tracks toward Pioneer Square, Jason braced himself for what was to come. The tram approached Pioneer Square slowly, the lights from the street lamps outside flickering in and out of view as the fog thickened and curled against the windows like something alive. Jason's heart pounded in his chest. Every second stretched out like an eternity, the air in the tram heavy and oppressive. He stared down at the man, still slumped in his seat, motionless, with an expression that was unnervingly blank. The sense of isolation Jason had felt earlier was now suffocating, and he found himself clenching his fists in his lap. As the tram came to a stop, Jason heard the low hum of the approaching police car. His phone buzzed again, this time with a notification that caused him to pause. Police en route, arrival in 3 minutes. Jason stared at the notification, his mind racing. He had called 911 nearly 20 minutes ago. Why had it taken so long for them to arrive? Was there a delay? Did something happen? Or were they simply overwhelmed with other calls? Jason's breath was shallow and rapid. He glanced again at the man, half expecting to see some small shift in his posture, some sign that the man might have come back to life, but the figure was still as dead as it had been when Jason first noticed. The man's mouth was slack, his skin pale and sickly under the harsh fluorescent lights of the tram. A cold sweat broke out across Jason's back. He had never felt this kind of unease before. It wasn't just the death, it was the unknown. Who was this man? How had he ended up here, on this tram, in the middle of the night? Was he a victim of something more sinister? Or had he simply overdosed, like Jason had briefly considered earlier? The tram doors slid open with a creak, revealing the dark, desolate streets of Pioneer Square. Jason stepped off the tram and into the cold night air. The fog wrapped around him like a heavy blanket, damp and suffocating. He glanced up at the empty square, feeling a sharp pang of loneliness. No one was around. It was as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. Jason's phone buzzed again. Police now on site, officer on board. A uniformed officer stepped onto the tram and nodded at Jason. He was tall, with a stern face, his eyes scanning the area with practiced professionalism. He was older, with grey hairs at his temples, and there was a tiredness to his posture, like he had seen too much in his time on the force. "Sir," the officer said, his voice low and calm, "what's going on?" Jason stepped back, giving the officer room to pass. He could barely meet the officer's eyes as he gestured to the dead man in the seat. I found him like this. I called 911. The officer gave a brief nod and stepped forward, his flashlight cutting through the dim light of the tram. He crouched beside the man, his eyes narrowing as he examined the body. He didn't touch the man, but his gaze was intense and methodical, taking in every detail. The disheveled clothes, the pallor of the skin, the way the man's body had fallen limply against the window. Jason could hardly stand to watch. He looked away, feeling the knot in his stomach tighten. The sense of dread was now fully settled in his chest, heavy and immovable. His mind kept returning to the same questions. Who was this man? How had he ended up dead in this tram? Was this a random overdose, or something more sinister? The officer reached into his pocket and pulled out a pair of gloves. He slid them on slowly, his movements deliberate and careful. "Sir," he said, glancing back at Jason, "I need you to step outside the tram. I'll take it from here." Jason hesitated, his pulse quickening. The last thing he wanted was to leave the tram, but the officer was already beginning to look around for more evidence. Jason stepped out, feeling the weight of the cold air press against his skin. His breath came out in short, uneven bursts, his mind still racing. The officer stepped out behind him, keeping his distance as he called in the details over his radio. Jason could hear the low hum of the officer's voice, punctuated by the occasional crackle of static. Jason could feel the eyes of passing cars on him, the headlights briefly illuminating his face as the vehicles passed by. The square was eerily empty, the kind of place where anything could happen under the cover of night. He kept looking over his shoulder at the tram, waiting for the officer to finish his call. After a few moments, the officer turned back to him and sighed. "I'm going to need to ask you a few questions, sir. Just a routine procedure, nothing to worry about." Jason felt a wave of nausea wash over him. "Of course," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The officer motioned for him to sit on the nearby bench, out of the way of the streetlights. He sat down next to Jason, pulling out a small notebook and a pen. Jason's hands shook as he tried to calm himself, his thoughts swirling in every direction. He was starting to wonder if the whole night was some kind of bad dream, like any minute now he'd wake up and everything would be normal again. "All right," the officer said, flipping open his notebook. "I need your name and your contact information. What were you doing here, on the tram tonight?" Jason swallowed hard. He could barely concentrate. "I was just coming home from the airport. My flight got in late, and I was heading back into the city." The officer scribbled down the details, then looked back at him with sharp, calculating eyes. "And you didn't know this man beforehand?" Jason shook his head. "No. I've never seen him before. I just got on the tram, and he was already sitting there." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Did you notice anything unusual about him? Any strange behavior before he fell asleep?" Jason hesitated. He thought about the strange way the man had been slumped over, how he hadn't moved at all since Jason had boarded the tram. "No. He was just sitting there. I thought maybe he was drunk or something." The officer made a note in his book. "Did you hear anything out of the ordinary? Any loud noises? Something that might have caused the man to collapse?" Jason shook his head. "No. It was quiet. Too quiet." The officer pressed his lips together, then flipped his notebook shut. "All right. I think I have everything I need for now. I'll need you to wait here while we handle things inside." Jason watched the officer turn and head back toward the tram. His hands were still trembling, but he couldn't bring himself to move. The sense of helplessness was overwhelming, and the questions in his mind only multiplied. Who was this man? Why was he alone on a late-night tram in the first place? And most of all, how had he died so suddenly, without any warning? The officer was still inside the tram, speaking into his radio and moving around the body with methodical care. Jason could hear the faint hum of his voice, but the words were too muffled for him to make out. He felt like a spectator, like he was observing everything from a distance, detached and powerless. After what seemed like an eternity, the officer finally stepped out of the tram, his face somber. He approached Jason slowly, holding up a plastic bag with a few personal items inside. "We found this on him," the officer said. "A wallet, a phone, some identification. His name was Michael Harris. He was 39. Jason felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Michael Harris. The name felt strange in his mouth, as if he had spoken a name he'd never known. He hadn't even considered that the man might have been carrying anything. He had just assumed he was a stranger with nothing left in the world. Jason's hands tightened into fists. The reality of the situation was starting to sink in. This wasn't some random encounter. There was something more here, something dark and hidden. And Jason had been there, alone with the man, when it all unfolded. Was there anything suspicious? Jason asked, his voice shaky. The officer met his gaze, his eyes hard and unyielding. "We are going to have to investigate further, but for now, it looks like an overdose. We'll be sending his belongings in for testing, but there's nothing to suggest foul play at the moment." Jason felt a wave of relief, mixed with a strange sense of dread. An overdose. It made sense. It was the simplest explanation. But something in the back of his mind refused to let it go. "Alright," the officer said, "you can go home now. We'll contact you if we need any more information." Jason nodded numbly, feeling his legs give way beneath him. The dread still gnawed at the pit of his stomach. He turned and began to walk away, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the answers he was looking for were still out of reach. As he disappeared into the mist, the feeling followed him, like a shadow that wouldn't leave. It had been 3 days since Jason's late-night encounter with Michael Harris, the man who had died alone on the tram. Since then, Jason had tried to move on with his life. The police had finished their investigation, and there had been no further contact with him. It seemed like an overdose. The toxicology reports hadn't come back yet, but Jason had been told there was nothing suspicious about the man's death, no signs of foul play. But Jason couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it, something he wasn't being told. The following day, Jason returned to work at the accounting firm. He tried to act normal, but something about the previous night gnawed at him. The more he replayed the event, the less sure he became about the simplicity of the situation. Something about Michael's stillness, his pale complexion, the way he had been slumped against the window, it didn't sit right with Jason. His mind kept drifting back to the way the man had looked, not just dead, but frozen in time. Jason had been alone with him for so long, yet the man hadn't moved. It was as if the death had been a slow, drawn-out thing, but Michael had been unaware. Or worse, as if the death had been inescapable. "Maybe it's just paranoia," Jason muttered to himself, rubbing his temple as he worked. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Michael's face. That evening, Jason found himself pacing around his small apartment, unable to sleep. He had made the mistake of asking the police a few questions about the investigation, nothing in depth, just asking if they had found anything new. They had assured him they were still waiting on the toxicology report, and that the case was open but not suspicious. Yet the way they had brushed him off felt wrong. They had seemed too quick to classify it as an overdose. Something was missing. Jason leaned against the window and stared down into the empty streets of Portland. The same fog from that night still clung to the ground, wrapping itself around the street lamps. The city seemed like a different place now, quiet and hollow. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "You shouldn't have called the police." His heart dropped. His phone slipped from his grasp and hit the floor with a dull thud. Jason spent the next day avoiding his phone. He had received several more strange texts, all from the same unknown number, each one more cryptic than the last. "You don't know what you've done. They're coming for you. You'll never be free of this." Jason couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. Every time he stepped outside, he felt eyes on him. His nerves were on edge, his mind racing. He couldn't tell if it was the stress of the situation or something more sinister, but he knew that he needed to get to the bottom of this. Michael Harris's death was not as simple as the police made it out to be. After work, Jason went to the Portland Police Department, hoping to speak with Detective Stevens, the officer who had initially responded to the scene. Jason's nerves were raw, and he could barely focus on what he was saying when he finally got through to the detective's desk. Stevens was not available, but the woman behind the counter handed him a folder. "This is all the information we have on the case so far." Jason opened the folder, scanning the report. Most of it seemed routine. Michael Harris had a criminal record for minor drug offenses, but nothing that stood out as alarming. There were no signs of foul play, and the officer noted that the man had been found dead from what appeared to be a drug overdose. However, as Jason flipped through the pages, something caught his eye, a small note that had been stapled to the back of the folder. It was an email printed from Michael's phone, one that had been flagged as suspicious by the investigators. "They know. They're coming. I can't hide anymore. I'm scared." The words jumped out at him. Jason's skin crawled. This was the first clue that Michael had left, a frantic message written in the last hours of his life. But what did it mean? And who had Michael been trying to hide from? Jason stepped out of the police station and felt the cold wind against his face. His mind was spinning with questions, but one thing was clear: Michael's death was more than just an overdose. It was a warning. Jason had somehow been dragged into something bigger, something far more dangerous. That night, Jason stayed up late, poring over every detail of the case. He reread the police reports, trying to find something, anything, that would explain Michael's last words. The man had been running from something, Jason was sure of it. But what had it been? Jason glanced at his phone, noticing a new notification. It was a news alert. Missing man found dead in southeast Portland. Authorities investigate possible foul play. His heart raced as he clicked the link. The article was brief, but it described the discovery of another body, a man in his late 30s, found in a park not far from where Michael Harris had been found. The police had initially ruled it as an overdose as well, but the investigation was still ongoing. Jason sat up straight. The similarities between the two cases were too close to ignore. Another man had died under suspicious circumstances in the same general area, and it had all been written off as drug-related deaths. He grabbed his jacket and left the apartment, heading toward the park. As he walked, Jason tried to make sense of it all. The idea that Michael's death was connected to the new one seemed too unlikely to be true, but the more Jason thought about it, the more he realized how little sense the police's explanations made. Two men, both with criminal pasts, both found dead in isolated locations. Could it all be a coincidence? Jason's footsteps echoed through the empty streets as he approached the park. The mist had thickened once again, and the park was almost entirely deserted, save for a few stray dogs wandering near the edges of the paths. He made his way toward a bench under a large oak tree, where the body had been found. Jason's stomach churned. The eerie feeling he had experienced on the tram was back, a sense of being watched, of being drawn into something too large for him to comprehend. He sat down on the bench and pulled his coat tighter around him, feeling a chill crawl up his spine. His phone buzzed. Another text from the unknown number. "You shouldn't have come here. They know you're looking." Jason froze. A figure stepped out of the shadows at the edge of the park. Jason couldn't make out the face, but he felt the unmistakable presence of someone watching him. His heart pounded in his chest as the figure moved closer. Suddenly, his phone rang. It was an unlisted number. "Hello," Jason whispered, his voice shaky. A voice crackled on the other end. "You need to leave now." Before Jason could respond, the line went dead. The figure in the park took a step closer, and Jason's pulse quickened. He wasn't alone. The world seemed to shrink around him as panic set in. He stood up, turning on his heel and running back toward the park entrance. But just as he reached the road, he was stopped in his tracks by a blinding light. A car pulled up, its headlights illuminating the street. Jason could barely see the figure behind the wheel, but he knew something was horribly wrong. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped out of the car, tall and broad-shouldered. They didn't say a word as they approached him. Jason's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs were frozen in place. The figure reached into their coat pocket and pulled out something small, something that gleamed in the light. A knife. Jason took a step back, his breathing erratic. The figure moved forward. The figure in the shadows moved closer, the knife gleaming under the cold streetlight, its sharp edge reflecting the faint glow of the city. Jason's heart was pounding so hard it seemed to reverberate through his entire body. His legs felt like they were sinking into the concrete, his feet unwilling to move as the fear gripped him like a vice. "Why?" Jason choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" The figure said nothing, but their face was shrouded in darkness. They moved closer, their footsteps almost soundless, like a predator stalking its prey in the night. Jason's mind was racing. He needed to think. He couldn't run, not with the knife in their hand. But he couldn't stay here either. The park was desolate, no one was around, and the dim streetlights cast long shadows that seemed to dance and twist as the fog rolled in, swallowing the streets. The figure stopped just a few feet in front of him. Jason could see the outline of their face now, the features shadowed, but there was something cold and unmistakably malicious about the way they stood. Without warning, Jason bolted. His legs finally moved, pumping faster than he ever thought they could. He heard the sound of the figure's footsteps behind him, quick and deliberate. The knife was still there, the flash of it just behind him, like the promise of death itself. Jason turned the corner and sprinted toward an alley, knowing that if he could reach the next block, he might find safety somewhere where people were still awake, where the streets weren't so empty. He ran, not daring to look back, until he reached the street where a few late-night diners were still open. His breath was coming in ragged gasps. He rounded a corner, nearly colliding with a trash can, but he didn't stop. His lungs burned. His muscles screamed in protest. He needed help. Jason pulled out his phone, hands trembling, but before he could dial the number, the screen went dark. The battery had died. "Damn it," he whispered, tossing the phone into a nearby bin. Just then, the sound of footsteps echoed behind him. They were quieter now, more deliberate, and Jason knew the figure had stopped chasing him. He dared to look back, his heart still racing, but the street was empty. For a moment, everything seemed eerily calm, as if time had stopped. He could see his breath in the air, the white clouds of it mixing with the fog. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting a low, yellow light. But then, the silence was shattered by a voice. It came from behind him. "You shouldn't have called the police," the voice said, smooth and low, but not at all unfamiliar. Jason spun around, his blood turning to ice. Standing there, not 10 feet away, was the last person he had ever expected to see. It was Detective Stevens. The same officer who had questioned him the night Michael Harris had died. The detective was calm, too calm, his hands in his coat pockets. He didn't look surprised to see Jason. If anything, he looked pleased. "What the hell is this?" Jason demanded, his voice trembling. Stevens didn't answer. Instead, he took a step closer, his shadow falling across Jason's face. "You shouldn't have come here," Stevens said, his voice low and almost regretful. "You've been asking too many questions, Jason." Jason felt the weight of the situation sink in, a chill running down his spine. The world around him seemed to tilt. Everything he had thought he knew was slipping away. Michael wasn't just some random junkie, the detective continued, his eyes cold and calculating. He was a part of something bigger. Something much bigger than you can understand. Jason took a step back, his mind reeling. What are you talking about? Stevens shook his head. You don't get it, do you? They're watching. They always have been. And you're part of it now. Whether you want to be or not. Jason's blood ran cold. The words didn't make sense, but somehow, deep down, he understood. Everything that had happened, the late-night tram, the strange messages, the missing man in the park, it wasn't a coincidence. None of it had been. Stevens reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. Michael was the warning, he said. You were supposed to leave this alone. Jason's mind was racing. He had no idea what the detective was talking about, but it was clear now that Stevens was more than just an officer. He wasn't who Jason had thought he was. You're not a cop, are you? Jason said, the question spilling out before he could stop it. Stevens didn't answer. Instead, he held out the envelope, his eyes never leaving Jason's. Jason swallowed hard. What's in it? The detective's lips curled into a thin smile. A message. Jason reached out instinctively, his hand trembling as he took the envelope from the detective. The moment his fingers brushed against it, a wave of nausea hit him. He tore it open, revealing a set of photographs, grainy, poorly taken images of Jason, Michael Harris, and several other people Jason didn't recognize. They were all taken in various places around the city, sometimes in the dark, sometimes from across the street. Jason's eyes widened as he scanned the pictures. There was no mistaking the faces. The people in these images were all connected, whether by fate or by something far more sinister. One of the photos caught his eye. It was taken on the tram, the same tram where Michael had died. And in the background of the image, barely visible in the shadows, was a man Jason hadn't seen before. But the look on the man's face, the way he stood just out of focus, sent a chill down Jason's spine. Who are they? Jason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What is this? Stevens's smile widened. He took a step back and turned away, as if the answer to Jason's question no longer mattered. They're always watching, the detective said, his voice fading. And now, so are you. Jason stood there, staring down at the photographs. His mind was reeling. He couldn't make sense of what was happening, but one thing was certain, his life had changed forever. Michael Harris wasn't the only victim. There were others. And now, Jason was part of whatever dark, hidden web had been spinning behind the scenes. As Jason looked up, Stevens was gone, disappearing into the mist as if he had never been there at all. Jason looked down at the envelope, his hands shaking, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun, he felt truly, terrifyingly alone. The fog closed in around him, swallowing the street, and Jason realized something that sent his heart into overdrive. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning.